the first thing many captives heard was not a scream, but music. Not the music of celebration, not the music of peace, but drums deep, steady, relentless, echoing across stone and water, growing louder with every step toward the city that many prisoners would never leave alive. To the people being marched forward with bound hands and bruised bodies, that sound meant only one thing. You were no longer a soldier. You were no longer a rival. You were no longer even fully a person in the eyes of the empire that had taken you. You had become an offering. And what happened next was far stranger, more ritualized, and in many ways more terrifying than modern movies ever show. Because when we imagine the Aztecs, most people picture a single brutal image, a temple, a blade, a sacrifice. But that image, while rooted in reality, is only the surface. The truth beneath it is far more disturbing, not just because of the violence, but because of how organized, meaningful, and deeply woven into daily life it was. Captured prisoners were not always killed immediately. Sometimes they were fed, dressed, displayed, questioned, exchanged, humiliated, paraded, transformed into symbols, or made to perform roles in ceremonies they barely understood. And for some of them, the worst part was not the ending, it was the waiting. To understand what really happened to prisoners taken by the Aztecs, you have to forget the idea of random savagery. This was not chaos, it was structure, belief, state power, sacred theater. Warfare and religion fused so tightly together that to be captured in battle was not simply to lose a fight, it was to fall into an entire system designed to turn your body into proof that the universe itself was still functioning. That is what made it so terrifying, because your death was not only useful, it was holy, and once a society convinces itself that violence is sacred, almost anything becomes possible. But no one saw what came next. To understand the fate of Aztec prisoners, we have to begin not at the temple, but in the world that produced it. Long before the Spanish arrived and began writing horrified descriptions of what they saw, the Mexica, the people we usually call the Aztecs, had built one of the most powerful and sophisticated empires in the ancient Americas. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco, like a vision. Causeways stretching over the lake, canals crossing neighborhoods, bustling marketplaces, towering temples, palaces, schools, gardens, workshops, and crowded streets filled with traders, nobles, priests, farmers, warriors, servants, and slaves. To European eyes, when the Spanish first saw it, the city seemed almost unreal. And that is what makes the darker side of it even more haunting. Because the Aztec world was not primitive chaos. It was disciplined, urban, literate in its own way, politically complex, and culturally rich. It produced poetry, law, architecture, astronomy, trade networks, educational systems, and a ruling class obsessed with order and legitimacy. But at the center of that order stood a brutal conviction: the cosmos was unstable. The sun was not guaranteed to rise forever. The gods had sacrificed for humanity. Humanity now owed blood in return. This was not metaphor. This was reality to them. That changes everything. Because once sacrifice is no longer seen as cruelty but as duty, the captive warrior ceases to be just a defeated enemy. He becomes raw material for cosmic maintenance. Imagine living inside that worldview. The rains come because the gods are fed. The crops grow because the rituals are performed. The empire remains strong because divine balance is maintained. If the rituals stop, the sky itself could betray you. The world could slide into famine, darkness, collapse. Now imagine being a prisoner dragged into that system. You are not simply hated. You are needed, and being needed in the wrong civilization can be a terrible thing. Everything was about to change. Aztec warfare was not identical to the total annihilation warfare many people imagined from later empires. Yes, territory mattered. Yes, tribute mattered. Yes, intimidation and imperial control mattered. But so did captives. In fact, one of the most important measures of a warrior's success was not just how many enemies he killed, but how many he captured alive. That detail is crucial, because it meant the battlefield itself was often shaped by a different logic. Warriors trained not only to strike and survive, but to seize, restrain, and bring back human bodies. Elite status, prestige, military promotion, and social honor were tied to this ability. A young man's rise in Aztec society could depend on it. The taking of prisoners was not incidental to war. It was one of its main purposes. Think about what that means for the defeated. If your enemy wants you dead, that is one kind of fear. If your enemy wants you alive for something worse, that is another. And many neighboring peoples understood exactly what capture might mean. That is one reason why battles in central Mexico could be fought with such intensity and symbolic weight. For many communities, defeat was not abstract. It could mean tribute, humiliation, loss of autonomy, and the terrifying possibility that your warriors, nobles, or even young men of status would be marched back to Tenochtitlan to become part of a ritual machine. And yet, the system was even more chilling than that, because not every prisoner experienced the same fate. Some were low-status captives, destined for quick sacrifice. Some were retained for ceremonies. Some could be enslaved. Some were used in displays of imperial dominance. Some, especially nobles or important enemy figures, could become politically valuable. The Aztec Empire was not mindless in how it processed captives. It categorized them, and categorization is where cruelty becomes administrative. But no one saw what came next. One of the most unsettling features of the Aztec world was the way war, ritual, and public spectacle overlapped. Captives were not always hidden away in dark cells awaiting death. Sometimes they were made visible, publicly visible, because the empire needed people to see what happened to enemies. This was not merely punishment, it was communication. When prisoners were brought into the city, their presence reinforced the prestige of the warriors who had captured them, the strength of the state, and the favor of the gods. Crowds could see them. Priests could prepare them. Nobles could read political meaning into their identities. Families of successful warriors could celebrate the honor brought home by a captive. Young boys could watch and learn what valor looked like. Young girls could witness the social rewards tied to military glory. The captive body, in other words, was political theater, and the prisoner knew it. Imagine entering Tenochtitlan not as a traveler, but as prey. You see the city's astonishing size, the gleam of temples, the movement of canoes through canals, the market noise, the smell of food, flowers, incense, sweat and water, the order of it all, the beauty of it, and then you realize every bit of this magnificence has a place prepared for your suffering. That may have been one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Aztec captivity, not chaos, ceremony, because chaos can feel temporary. A riot, a panic, a battlefield frenzy. Those are storms. But ritualized violence feels eternal. It tells the victim, this is not an accident. This was built for you long before you arrived. That decision would alter history forever. Among the most famous and misunderstood forms of Aztec warfare were the so-called flower wars. Ritualized conflicts fought especially between the Mexica and enemies like Tlaxcala. These wars were not meaningless mock battles, as some older simplifications suggest, nor were they merely sporting contests. They were deeply political, strategic, and religious. They helped maintain martial culture, prestige, and a supply of captives for sacrifice, while also managing regional rivalries. And that is where the horror sharpens. Because some prisoners were taken not in the chaotic desperation of accidental defeat, but in conflicts where both sides already understood that capture itself was part of the logic of war. Imagine fighting in a world where your enemy's ideal victory is not just your death, but your controlled survival. You are disarmed, bound, preserved, and transported toward a fate your culture has feared for generations. This is one of the reasons neighboring peoples hated Aztec domination so deeply. It was not simply taxation or imperial arrogance, it was existential dread. Communities on the empire's edges knew that their sons could become offerings in ceremonies that glorified the very power crushing them. And hatred like that does not disappear, it waits. That becomes important later. Very important. Because one of the greatest hidden truths in the fall of the Aztec Empire is that when the Spanish arrived, they did not conquer Mexico alone. They stepped into a landscape already thick with resentment, and the treatment of prisoners was part of why. But no one saw what came next. The path from battlefield capture to ritual death was not always immediate. Sometimes captives were held for days, weeks, or longer depending on the occasion, their status, or the calendar. That waiting period may have been psychologically unbearable. Not only because of uncertainty, but because many prisoners would have understood enough of local custom to know that they were being preserved for a reason. You were being kept intact because your body still had value. And that kind of value is terrifying. Some captives were reportedly fed and maintained physically, not out of compassion, but because a weak, ruined, or dying offering diminished the ritual. Certain ceremonies demanded presentation, dignity, choreography. The victim had to arrive at the right place in the right condition. In some cases, captives were even adorned or treated with a kind of ceremonial attention that, to modern eyes, feels almost more disturbing than straightforward cruelty. Because what do you do with a civilization that can decorate the person it plans to kill? What do you call a system that can be both reverent and merciless at the same time? That contradiction lies at the heart of Aztec captivity. The prisoner could be honored and doomed, respected and consumed, human and symbolic all at once. Everything was about to change. Some of the most chilling accounts involve captives who were made to participate in ceremonies before death, sometimes dancing, sometimes being displayed, sometimes being transformed into temporary embodiments of sacred meaning. One of the most discussed ritual patterns in Aztec religion involved the impersonation of deities, where a selected individual could be dressed, adorned, and treated as a living image of a god for a period before being sacrificed. Not every such figure was a battlefield prisoner, and scholars debate the details of specific cases, but the broader pattern matters deeply, because it shows that in this world, your identity could be taken from you before your life was. You might be captured as a warrior, and die as a symbol. That is a special kind of annihilation. Not only are you removed from your people, but you are absorbed into the mythology of the empire that defeated you. Your death is rewritten to mean something in their language, not yours. Your body becomes a statement in a theology you never accepted. For many prisoners, that may have been the true horror. Not simply dying, but being spiritually appropriated by the enemy. And that is something films almost never capture. Because it is not just physical terror, it is metaphysical terror. But no one saw what came next. There is another layer to this story that often gets flattened by sensationalism. Not all captives were anonymous nobodies. Some were warriors of rank, some were politically meaningful. Some came from communities that would remember them, mourn them, and interpret their fate in very specific ways. In warrior cultures across Mesoamerica, capture carried shame, tragedy, and sometimes complex ideas about honor and destiny. That means captivity was not only a personal ordeal, it was social collapse. If you were a noble warrior taken alive, your family's grief would be tangled with humiliation. Your city might view your death through ritual expectations of its own. Songs might be composed. Anger might deepen. Rivalries might sharpen. Memory itself could become a battlefield. And when enough communities accumulate enough such memory, empires become brittle. This is one of the reasons Aztec power looked so formidable from the center, and yet proved more fragile than expected under external shock. Systems built on fear can expand rapidly. They can appear invincible, but they also manufacture enemies with extraordinary motivation to destroy them. The empire was feared, it was admired, it was hated. That tension sat under everything. That decision would alter history forever. To understand what prisoners really faced, we also need to understand the sacred geography of the city itself. Tenochtitlan was not just a political capital, it was a ritual landscape. Temples rose as mountains of meaning, stairs climbed toward divine spaces, public plazas opened before monumental architecture. Ceremonies unfolded in places where everyone could see or at least know what was happening. That visibility mattered, because sacrifice was not hidden in a basement. It was integrated into the life of the state. Now imagine being led upward, step by step, toward one of those high temple platforms. The city spreads around you, water glitters in the distance, drums pound, incense thickens the air, priests move, with terrifying calm. The crowd below becomes a blur of faces. The sky feels too wide. The stone beneath your feet is warm. And suddenly you understand something that is worse than panic. You understand that everyone here already knows their role. Everyone except you. That may be the loneliest kind of fear a human being can feel. Not just pain, not just helplessness, but total exclusion from the meaning of what is happening to you. And when people are excluded from meaning, terror grows sharper. Because the mind cannot bargain with a ritual it does not belong to. Everything was about to change. The Spanish would later write about these practices with a mixture of horror, fascination, opportunism, and self-justification. That means we must be careful. European chroniclers often exaggerated or framed indigenous practices in ways that served conquest. They wanted Christian audiences back home to see the Aztecs as monstrous. That made invasion easier to morally sell. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Propaganda often works best when it is built around something real. And something real was there. Archaeology, indigenous sources, codices, and comparative scholarship all confirm that ritual sacrifice was not an invented fantasy. Captivity, ceremonial killing, and the political use of prisoners were woven into the structure of Aztec power. The challenge is not deciding whether it happened. The challenge is understanding what it meant inside that world. And once you begin to understand that meaning, the story becomes even darker. Because the most terrifying systems are rarely the ones that think they are evil. They are the ones that think they are necessary. And that is where the final and perhaps most unsettling truth emerges. For the Aztecs, the prisoner's suffering was not simply tolerated. It was transformed into order. By the time a captive reached the last stage of that journey, his body no longer belonged to him in any meaningful sense. It belonged to the warrior who had taken him, to the priests who prepared him, to the rulers who displayed him, to the crowd who interpreted him, and above all to the gods who were believed to require him. Every layer of society could claim a piece of his fate. That is what made captivity so complete. It was not merely imprisonment, it was absorption into a machine of power so total that even your final heartbeat could be made to serve the empire. And yet for many prisoners, the end was not always immediate. Some were forced into combat rituals so cruel they almost seemed designed by nightmare. In certain ceremonies, a captive warrior could be tied or weakened, and made to fight elite Aztec fighters in a staged hopeless spectacle. He might be given symbolic weapons or inferior arms while his opponents came prepared for real killing. To the watching crowd, this could be presented as valor, divine order, or ritual drama. But to the man at the center of it, it was something else entirely. It was the performance of false hope. And false hope can be more brutal than despair. Because despair at least ends the argument inside the mind. False hope keeps it alive. It tells the prisoner that maybe, somehow, there is still a path out. Maybe if he fights hard enough. Maybe if he wounds one opponent. Maybe if the gods of his own people still see him. Maybe if courage can still change the script. But the script had already been written. That is what made it terrifying. The captive was not fighting for freedom. He was fighting for the dignity of dying visibly. And in a warrior society, that mattered. That mattered more than we might think. Because even inside a ritual of domination, human beings still search for one final thing they can control. A glance, a shout, a refusal to beg, a final act of defiance. Many prisoners likely understood that their last moments would be remembered by enemies, and if news traveled home, by their own people. So even when stripped of power, some may have tried to shape memory. To die standing, to die resisting, to deny the empire the satisfaction of total submission. And that may be why the Aztec system was both effective and unstable. It could conquer bodies, but it could never fully conquer what those deaths meant to everyone else. Because every captive who died on a temple platform also became a story. A story told by grieving mothers, by surviving warriors, by rival cities, by children who grew up hearing what happened to their fathers and brothers, by enemies who learned to fear the Mexica, yes, but also to hate them with a hatred deep enough to wait for the right ally, the right weakness, the right fracture in the imperial wall. That fracture came sooner than anyone in Tenochtitlan imagined. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they encountered not a united civilization, but an empire held together by tribute, intimidation, ritual prestige, and military fear. Many indigenous peoples did not see the newcomers as immediate saviors. They saw them as dangerous strangers. But they also saw opportunity. And that opportunity existed because the Aztec Empire had spent generations manufacturing enemies. Enemies who remembered the captives. Enemies who remembered the tribute. Enemies who remembered the temples. That is one of history's cruelest ironies. The same system that made the Aztecs seem invincible also helped doom them. Because terror is powerful, but terror accumulates interest. Every public humiliation, every demanded tribute, every son marched away, in ropes, every captive body turned into ritual theater. None of it vanished. It sat in memory like dry brush waiting for a spark. And when that spark arrived in the form of steel, horses, disease, political chaos, and indigenous alliances, the empire that had once made prisoners of so many suddenly found itself trapped. Trapped by its own methods. Everything was about to change. And when Tenochtitlan finally fell in 1521, the end was catastrophic beyond imagination. The city that had once stunned the world with its scale, beauty, and order became a place of siege, starvation, slaughter, disease, and collapse. The temples that had once received prisoners now stood over a dying capital. The causeways clogged with the desperate. The canals filled with bodies. The empire that had fed on ritual certainty now faced something its worldview had never prepared it for. The gods did not save it. That silence must have been unbearable. Because what happens when a civilization builds part of its political and spiritual legitimacy on sacrifice, and then still loses everything? The answer is brutal. It means the victims were not enough. Or worse, it means the system was never what it claimed to be. And that may be the darkest lesson buried inside this story. Because what happened to Aztec prisoners was horrifying. Yes, but the true horror is larger than any single ritual, or blade, or temple staircase. The true horror is what human beings can justify when fear, power, religion, and state authority fuse into one unquestionable structure. Once a society convinces itself that suffering is necessary for survival, the line between devotion and cruelty begins to disappear. That is not just an Aztec lesson, that is a human lesson. It appears in empires, kingdoms, revolutions, and modern states. Different symbols, different gods, different uniforms. But the same cold logic: if the system must survive, someone else must be offered to it. That is why this story still matters. Not because it lets us look down on the past and call it savage, but because it forces us to confront how easily organized violence can become sacred in the minds of those who benefit from it. And that is far more frightening than anything in Apocalypto. Because movies end, real civilizations do not cut to black when the drums stop. They leave behind ruins, bones, stories, warnings. And if we listen closely enough, those warnings are still there, somewhere in the memory of central Mexico. Beyond the Spanish chronicles and the modern myths, beyond the sensational headlines and the simplified images, there remains the echo of what countless prisoners must have felt as they crossed into that magnificent and terrible city. The realization that they had entered a world where their death had already been explained, celebrated, and prepared long before they arrived. That is what made it worse than death. Not only that you would die, but that your death would belong to someone else's idea of order. And perhaps that is the final truth history keeps trying to tell us. The most dangerous civilizations are not always the bloodiest in appearance. They are the ones most certain that blood is justified. And once that certainty takes hold, the prisoner is never just a prisoner again. He becomes a message, a ritual, a warning, a sacrifice. And in the end, perhaps the most haunting question is not what happened to the captives of the Aztecs. It is how many times, in how many different forms, human history has found new ways to do the very same thing. Because the empire is gone, the temples are broken, the drums are silent, but the logic that built them, that never fully disappeared,